Hi, I'm Jake Ray, and today on the Student Slant, we talk about photos and the role it plays in being a student journalist.
So when I was 4 years old, my parents bought me this pink little Barbie Polaroid camera. And they bought me a bunch of film, and I would take that camera and I would go outside and take photos of anything. And I would take photos of anything in our house, our pets, my mom, what we were having for dinner that night, all of my stuffed animals. And I that was the day that I fell in love with photography, when they bought me that camera. And it gave me the opportunity to really look at the world in a more in-depth way, and to figure out the small nuances, the intricate details of what really exists. And ever since then, my parents had helped invest in that passion for photography and pointing out those details and showing the beauty in our world, and sometimes the sadness too. Um, and so that's how I fell in love with photography, and ever since then, I've been really invested in doing nature photography and photographing people and landscapes and just some of the beautiful places that exist. And ever since I got involved in journalism, I've been able to see different kinds of emotions and different kinds of people and the way that the world works in a different way. I'm Ris Twigg.
I'm Zach Varda.
I'm Jake Ray, and this is the Student Slant. So, personally, why do you feel photos are so essential to journalism?
So photos help tell the story. There's the cliche of a picture's worth 1,000 words, and really it is. It helps the audience, it helps the reader really kind of put themselves into the landscape of what's happening. So, when it comes to your story, you have a bunch of black and white text on a piece of paper, right? And so when you add that photo, it gives it that much more vibrance. It gives it that much more detail. And a lot of times, the photographs that accompany stories aren't always exactly what's happening, but they're just a supplemental detail that really helps boost the story. And a lot of times, there's things like, when you look at a person, it's you can see their face, you can see the emotion that's there, and that can really help the reader identify, wow, I felt like that before, or if I saw someone I knew that looked in that much distress, or doing something like this, it just really helps draw some attention to the story and really connect the reader to the emotional component of your story.
Yeah, so as a writer, you talked about how the photo really doesn't match the text all the time. It's sort of supplemental. So how do you get that image, and how do you know what image you want to take from the story? You just have a journalist saying, "All right, I'm going in doing this. This is what the story is about, really quick. I haven't even written it yet. We're just doing an interview. You're just coming to take pictures." So how do you visualize the image that you think is going to fit that article perfectly?
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, always communicate with the reporter. It's so important, and I cannot stress that enough. Being able to work with the reporters and figure out, ask them all the questions that you can. So, when you're going on assignment with them, so you have the background information. Do a little research yourself as well. See what the topic is. So, for example, I'll use the time that I went with you, Jake, to take some photos of the video game research story. And I asked you questions about what was going to be there, what was happening, who we were meeting with, what kind of setup it might be. And we went, and you get a look for the space. You kind of feel out how it's going to be. If you have the opportunity, by all means, scope out the area beforehand. That's really important, because sometimes it helps to get, a blank canvas image of like what's there. So if you're going to a specific meeting, it can help to just visualize what the room is like. Um, in addition, once you do get there, look at the small details in the room. So, is there, what's the person wearing? What kind of, is that particular to the story? What are they doing? How are they interacting with other people in this story? So, in a situation, if you have a researcher, if you're talking to the researcher, okay, what what interesting things in their office or their lab might they have? What are some of those details? Really being able to pick apart, the story may be about a specific type of research, so look into that kind of the detail. Research that subject, learn more about it, and you as the photographer can really learn more in depth about what that subject is.
Yeah, and I know for your example where we were going to talk about the stroke and MS research with the Xbox Connect, uh, how did it help that the subject that we had was so like good at working with everything there, and he was such a good photo subject as well as an overachiever in the research, and how he worked together with the physical therapist and everyone around him. He just really, I feel like, embodied the story, and his pictures really helped enhance the story. So, how does it work when you have such a good subject like that? How does that feel, like, as a photographer coming in and like knowing what you need to do?
Yeah. So for me, the first thing I did, I don't know if you noticed, was, we met Herb, and he was a fantastic gentleman, and I tried to ask him a couple questions about how his day was going, and general things like the weather, small talk, just to kind of create that base relationship with him, just to let him know that, hey, I'm here and I will be like taking photos, and just to, if he has any questions, anything, feel free to ask. So I think it's important, first of all, to build that relationship with them, and then on top of that, just having a fantastic, he was an incredible person to photograph, and he made it really easy, and so knowing your subject and getting more information about your subject is really important. But that's not always going to be the case. You're not always going to have someone who is as social or who is as open to photographs. They might be a little more shy, and so then you as the photographer, you as you're a photojournalist. You're still reporting on a story. You have to be able to build that relationship. You have to be able to ask questions. And so if someone is a little timid about getting their photo taken, you have to work your best in a very natural way, of course, to kind of alleviate some of that stress or anxiety around it.
Yeah, it seems even too that with as a journalist, like, you have to talk people into getting comfortable before your interview. So I feel like with photojournalism, it has to be even harder.
So, as a student photojournalist, as a photojournalist or a journalist at a student newspaper, you kind of run the gamut from people who have been interviewed 100 times to people who have never been interviewed, from being in a lecture hall to covering a political protest. I mean, we have just stories all along the gambit here. Like, what unique challenges does that present, or is it kind of nice to always like have it, different change of pace?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, it's really fun to be able to, just on a very basic level, to be able to be exposed to all of these different sorts of, subjects and topics and articles and stories. So that's great. But sometimes, when it's very different covering a board of trustees meeting versus a protest. They're two very different things, and in both scenarios, there are sometimes very limited photos that you can get. A board of trustees meeting is just a meeting of some higher ups who are working on, some legislation or some rules or things, discussing agenda items, and so that's not always the most visually engaging for readers. But you have to do your best as the photojournalist to add that piece in, and so sometimes when you're photographing a board of trustees meeting, it's not about the fact that they're meeting. Just like when you're writing a story, the photo isn't meant to just be, oh, here's a picture of the board of trustees meeting in this room at this time. Okay, so what were they talking about? What kind of legislation were they talking about? What kind of information? And so I went to a board of trustees meeting that I covered for a story and also got photos for. Um, and I mean, it was an interesting one because they talked a lot about mental health. And so, in addition to the photos that I got of the meeting, it'd be really important to get photos of other places that talk about mental health. So, the Youngkin Student Success Center, the counseling and the counseling and consultation services center, those places, and so those kind of tie into the content of what the meeting was, and so you can always tell the people who have to further answer your question. You can tell the people who have been interviewed or photographed a bunch of times because they kind of get it. They don't really flinch. They don't really look at you. They just associate you as general media and press. And so those people they just do their thing, go on with their day, and they don't make moves to they don't adjust because you're there. Now the people who haven't been interviewed kind of they perk up a little bit, and, if they're nervous a little bit, they'll kind of show that and sometimes it's hard to get people to relax, like I said, and on top of that, you can kind of run into some problems with a lot of people like to pose, especially when you're at a protest or when you're at like a student event. People want to pose and smile for your photos, but you don't really want a posed picture. You want a real natural photo. So you have to keep your eye sharp for finding some of those moments. And that can take some time to learn. I mean, I've been, like I said, doing this since I was 4. And obviously when I was 4 years old, I wasn't looking for that sort of thing. But now through many years of working on this, it's something you develop over time, and it takes time and practice. And that's the thing. You have to go out and do it every day to get better.
Yeah, so kind of building off what Zach said, with such a large university, we have so many people that have maybe been interviewed hundreds of times, people who've never been interviewed, but we only have 2 photo editors at the Lantern, and there's a lot to cover, and there's a lot of stories coming in. So what is it like trying to cover such a large area with only really 2 people?
Whew, man, that's the question. That is the question of all questions, let me tell you. So each year, the Lantern tries to incorporate freelance photographers into what we do. But what happens is that we just don't have the capacity to hold up the accountability because there's not. So with the writing freelance portion of the Lantern, you get a credit for that class. And for the photography portion, you don't get a credit. And so it's hard to hold that accountability for assignments. So if people don't have the opportunity to cover a concert or people don't have the opportunity to cover a sporting game, people often don't want to photograph things on campus. And so that's really hard. So Jack and I, the other photo editor, really have to take it upon ourselves to either get out and take the photo, and we're already working, in the newsroom from 5 to 10 a few nights out of the week, in addition to the football games over the weekends, or we have to really rely on our reporters to get a photo while they're out covering stories and interviewing folks. So that can run into some issues sometimes when people aren't necessarily trained in photography. They don't know they don't know things like rule of thirds or how to frame a photo or composition and adjusting things like shutter speed or, ISO and things like that. So sometimes it can be a little frustrating. And a situation that happened a few months ago, we had this story in art section about this hip hop artist who rapped the Iliad by Shakespeare. Yeah, and it was incredible. He did some really cool stuff. But the photo we had was a photo that someone took of him in his living room with their cell phone, just with his mask on. It wasn't something we could put in print, and this story was going to go in print. So, we made some last minute phone calls and text messages, and I was thankfully able to go out and he had to go to Kroger, and I was like, I will meet you wherever you are. We just need a good photo for this story because it was the top story in arts, and we needed some good art for that story. And so I went out, I met him at Kroger, and I took his photo he brought some props with him. He brought the Iliad, the book, and some of his masks, and I set up the book and the mask in a certain way and had him sit in a pose just outside the brick wall by Kroger. And I took that shot. And if you look at it and compared it to the shot of him in his living room, just thinking about what that looks like is a little different. You have this set up pose shot that just of him in his what he would rap in, and versus in his living room. It just looked a little more artsy. And so that's some things you have to think about. In the art section, you can be a little more artsy and with your photos. In campus section, in campus and sports, you really need what's actually happening. You can't really pose or set up a photo. That's not really ethical to do that sort of thing. But because we were doing a profile on someone, it's known as an environmental portrait. So that's something that you can do. So that was getting a little off topic. But long story short, it's really hard to balance the breadth of photos that we need to take, because there's only two of us. And we have, there's like 25 people in the practicum class, and then another like 30 plus who are in the 22-21 on top of independent study students. That's, we probably go through like 30 stories plus a week. I don't know if that's an accurate number, but that's a lot of photos. That's a lot of photos for two people to get. So it really comes down to relying on reporters and just making do with what we can.
So going off that, student journalists have to take a lot of their own pictures now. You're relying on them to do it. Jobs want them to be able to do it. For someone that like rarely uses a camera, I guess from the photo editor, like what are you looking for? Like what are some basic tips so a student reporter can go out and like at least send in a usable picture?
Yeah, good question. So definitely looking for something well composed. And what I mean by that is it follows the rule of thirds. So if you split your photo frame into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, you normally want your subject to be at one of the intersecting corners in that photo. So there will be six intersecting corners, sorry. And you want them to be in one of those intersections. If you're photographing a person, you never want them in the center of the photo. You want to be able to guide the eye towards one side of the photo or the other. And so there's that. You want good lighting. So if you're shooting in a low light situation, say you're at like a panel talk speaking in Mershon Auditorium, it's a very limited amount of light. They're kind of just up on the stage, and so you want to be able to adjust your camera settings to match that. And so you don't just want. You want to be able to see the person's face. You want to be able to see their eyes. You want to be able to see the details of their face with a little bit of background stuff. When it comes to just general photos, good lighting, good color. So I like this example that we actually talked about last semester in Spencer Hunt's practicum class. So it's actually a sports reference, which, so the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune, I believe, I can't remember which had which, but one of them had a paid photographer on staff, and another did not. The other had their reporter go out and take the photo. And so what ended up happening was that one of them got the shot of them celebrating the victory, and another was just a very general shot. So when it comes to feature photos, you want a very specific moment in time. You don't want something that's just generally happening. You want something that's going to impact readers. So when you see a team celebrating their victory, that's way better than them just kind of walking off the field. And so you really want something. When you look at a photo, you want to be able to feel something. And so that's what I'm looking for. I'm wanting to see people, I'm wanting to feel an emotion coming out of this photo. I'm wanting to know the details. I want the photo to make me want to read your story, because most of the time, people are going to look at stories that have photos attached, that have good photos attached. And so on top of that, captions are absolutely important for photos. So if you don't have a properly captioned photo, sometimes we reuse photos for specific things, especially for sports. And if we don't know what's going on in that photo, we don't know who's in the photo, we don't know what year it's from, where it was taken, it's really hard to use that photo. And it's just really important because that photo will add extra information to your story. So not only is the photo itself important, it's also really important to have accompanying text with that photo describing what's happened. So things we're not looking for, we're not really looking for things that don't contain people as much. Sometimes that's really hard though, especially when it comes to research or when it comes to apps especially. Um, so really, really advocating for people a lot of the time, or like the action of what is happening in the story.
So those are great tips, but how would you say a student journalist can build those skills?
Yeah. Um, so here at Ohio State specifically, there are definitely student organizations. There's the Photography Enthusiast Society, which they meet. They have an opportunity to share your photos with others. Peer-to-peer review. Come in and see Jack and I. We would love to talk with anyone about their photo skills, about what they can do to get better. Honestly, just do a little reading online. Learn how to work the manual settings on your camera. That's the number one thing, is to just practice, trial and error. There's this quote that I love by, and I think I pronounced his name wrong, Ira Glass.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's about doing creative work, and those of us, I'm paraphrasing, but those of us who do creative work go through a lot of work. And in the beginning, you don't think that you're doing well at all. You think that your work is terrible and, you're never going to make it. But it's only by going through a volume of work, going through a lot of it, and doing whatever that creative industry is, that you'll be able to catch up. Because your eye can see what is good. Your eye knows what's good. But it's getting your brain to figure out how to do that needs to happen. So that transition only comes when you practice. It's just like a sport. You can't run, a marathon in one day. You have to practice. You have to start with lower mileage and work your way up. Just the same, it's really hard to learn how to work your ISO settings, your aperture settings, your the shutter speed. It's really hard to learn how to work all those things when you haven't started from the beginning. So I would say definitely do some reading online, come in and talk to Jack and I, and try to get yourself on a weekly kind of photo assignment. Set something up to where every week you have a mini project where you photograph something you love or something you don't like. That's something that's really hard, is photographing something you don't like. I'm not a big fan of sports, and everyone knows it, but I get the opportunity to go to the football games and photograph the football games. And I'll tell you, it's an incredible experience, but it is hard. And I've been learning a lot just by photographing something that I'm not normally as interested in. And so for me, that's been a really big learning experience. So I'd really advocate that just get out there and practice. Get a couple of friends together, and learn how to take photos with the camera. I know there's a lot of push towards like iPhone photography, but sometimes you can't get the zoom on that. Sometimes you can't get the shot you want with those. So it's really important, especially as student journalists. The job markets are really looking for people who encompass all of these skills. You need to be able to work with video. You need to be able to work with photo and be able to write the stories on a deadline and get that all in. And so as journalists in this day and age, it's going to get increasingly more competitive if you don't have those skills. And so it just makes you look a lot better on the job market, but also just makes you a more well-rounded journalist when you can think both in text and interviews and in photos.
That was a great discussion. Join us next week on the Student Slant, where we get more student perspective on another topic.